Okay, I think it's 1 o'clock. Welcome everybody. This is our next HDF clinic, and there were plenty of questions, and that's great to see. And but then I'm going to pause anyway and ask, are there any additional questions? So first thing, we will go through Robert's question or questions, and then if there are other questions, just that while I'm talking, I can start thinking about any other questions. No? Okay, then I will just go through Robert's questions. This discussion started last time where we were talking about using the split VFD, and then what about those files, or more generally speaking, for the multi VFD. And I thought about this a little bit, and I think the situation is actually much better than I thought. And okay, so first question, again, the idea with the split VFD, the split VFD is a so-called non-terminal VFD, which means that the split VFD basically splits the data stream that otherwise would go to an HDF5 file into two separate streams, sort of into, call it metadata and non-metadata, or raw. Some people talk about, call this raw data. And then you can write those separate streams into separate files, for example. And just before we continue, so that we are all in the same state of mind, so to speak, again, all these virtual file drivers, you configure them through a file access property list. And so in the case of the split VFD, you would add a property to a file access property list through this h5p set FAPL split call. And that call has basically these 5 arguments. The first is the file access property list to which you want to add this file access property. And then there are sort of 2 groups of arguments, one related to the raw data portion, or to the metadata portion of that stream, and the other part related to the raw or to the non-metadata portion of that stream. And then there are sort of 2 arguments in each category. In both cases, you can specify an extension, so you will provide typically a file name, and then the HDF5 library will append the respective extensions to that base file name, so to speak. And then you provide 2 additional file property lists, because again, the idea here is if you want to use that stacking metaphor, you will have certain terminal or even non-terminal VFDs that will be sitting below that split VFD. And on top of that sits the split VFD. Now we are splitting into sort of 2 data streams. And for each of these data streams, we will need additional file drivers. It could be sec2, it could be the core VFD, it could be something completely different. And it doesn't have to be the same VFD for the meta and raw data. They can be different. So it could be you are sending the metadata to the core VFD, you keep it in memory, and you are sending the raw data to sec2 to the POSIX driver and send it down into a POSIX file. That's possible. But so that's the picture, and you configure this with this set FAPL split call. And so that's the picture. And then so in this case, for example, yeah, for these or suffixes that we just saw, these extensions, that could be -s.h5. So I forgot what's intended here. Let's call this the metadata portion, and the -b.h5, let's call this the raw data portion. And oh, right, so we are talking about the multi, but that's okay. Split is just a special case of multi. And then so he says these files must remain co-located. And thinking about this, no, they do not have to, because I just gave you sort of a clue in the sense that are both files necessary in order to reproduce the HDF5 objects, so to speak, in memory, if you later want to read from them? Yes, absolutely. But do they have to be co-located necessarily in the file system? No. As long as you remember which two of these files, if they eventually, so to speak, from the writer's perspective, end up in the same file system or something. So we will have two files, let me call them for simplicity, file 1 and file 2. And as we said last time, from the perspective of the HDF5 library, in and of itself, either file alone is not a valid HDF5 file, in the sense that it doesn't really conform to the HDF5 file format specification, but taken together, you can reconstruct an HDF5 file from them. But the two files, although from the writer's perspective, they end up side by side in the same directory, so to speak, that's okay. But if we now take them, and I take one of them and move them to a different directory in the same file system, or somewhere else where I can access them to a file system that's mounted on a different mount point on the same host or something like that, that is perfectly fine, as long as, because now we are thinking in reverse. So now I want to reopen that file and I want to read from it. Well, what we have to do is, again, go through the same exercise. We have to create a file access property list, which is basically, which stacks the split VFD on top of the on top of another VFD, and it is really sort of the respective terminal VFD that will or two terminal VFDs. They could be the same VFD, they could be different VFDs. They will, we will have to create file access property lists for those. And I think it should work. Let me just think this through. Now that I think about it, I thought I had convinced myself of the other thing. It is true that when we do the H5F open call, then the H5F open call, I'm sorry, there you provide the base name, so to speak, and you provide the file access property list that we constructed as consisting of a stack of the splitter VFD on top of two other VFDs, and the two other VFDs could be the same or could be different. Now, that base name will be applied to these extensions. And yes, unfortunately, I think I was wrong. Since the base file name is the same, the base file name that will be passed on will be the same, there may not, although again, and now we are getting a little bit into a hacky situation where if the extension that the HDF5 library would append to the base file name would contain slashes. So you basically, instead of having an extension like -s.h5 or -b.h5, you would say /something else. If that could be resolved, including, let's say, a symbolic link, then, and this is something I have not tried, it would be a hack, and unfortunately, it wouldn't be pretty. but it might, it's not something that I have tried, but that might work. So if you sort of can use that base name and make the extension something that leads somewhere else in a different directory, somewhere on a different mount point, then you are only limited by this sort of by this base name, so to speak. And off the top of my head, I would believe that the HDF5 library really just appends these extensions to that base name. And if this extension contains slashes off the top of my head, I would not expect that the HDF5 library does any kind of checking, oh, that cannot contain any slashes. Again, it would be something that might hurt on Windows or a system that has a different file path separator convention and so forth. But let's, for argument's sake, stick with Linux or Unix. I think the library will not check that that path is really accessible at the moment, but it would be. So that would be perfectly legitimate. And then that might just work. So so I think I have not tried this, but I would expect this to work. Now, your flexibility, again, is limited by that base name. So if that base name cannot be constructed in a way for the use case here later, when we start talking about S3, that's a different story. But there might be a way, I would have to look at the code, there might be a way to sort of hack that, in the sense there will be a file driver structure that manages this virtual file, so to speak, and there might be a way to overwrite that path in that file structure by just knowing something about the internals. But okay, I apologize for sort of going off a little bit on a tangent. So I think there is no technical reason why this should not work. I think the only practical limitation is here that you are limited by this base file name, so to speak. But if what I think is correct, which is that this extension, this is sort of the recommended, so to speak, or what this was designed for, type of extension. But if you take the liberty and append something that leads you completely elsewhere, then I think as long as it can be resolved by the VFD, that at the end of the day will be the terminal one and will have to resolve this, as long as that's possible, you should be fine. Did that, is Robert here? Did that make sense?
Yes, Gerd, that's very good. That's very good.
Okay, right. So, and then they can, however, be copied into a read-only SD. Yes, of course. So let's say, for argument's sake, for simplicity, you construct these as regular files sitting side by side. Yes, you can absolutely take them as blobs and copy them into an S3 bucket as S3 objects, and absolutely no problem there. Now, and I think that's why this might work. So I think we are actually lucky at the end of the day, because I think the bigger problem is not so much the collocation. It is really, will this then work once we replace the sort of the file system path name with a URL or something like that. So I think that is what this question is about. An application can read the S3 multi-HDF5 file by configuring both the multi-file driver and the read-only S3 driver. So I would say yes, but I would also say, as far as I know, this combination is untested. In the sense that, as I said earlier, I have firsthand experience. I tried this with, for example, stacking the split VFD on top of the core VFD and the sec2 VFD, where I basically said, well, I want to keep all the metadata in memory and that's why I use the core VFD for that. And then for the non-metadata, I just use the Sec2, the regular POSIX VFD. And I know that works for a fact. I've tried that, I've used that, not a big deal. That's well understood. So by extension, I would say, if instead of where I use the core and the Sec2 VFD, you use in both cases the read-only S3 VFD, and you have them both as blobs, I think that should work just fine, because again, the base name will, if they are co-located in the same S3 bucket, the sort of the base URL will be exactly the same, and then you have slightly different suffixes. So I think that is absolutely fine. Now, ideally, of course, you would like to be able to do a trick, as I just said, where you would like to use the core VFD, let's say, for the metadata, because that way you would basically load all metadata into memory, and that's as fast as it can be as far as metadata accesses go, and then have the raw or the non-metadata portion, so to speak, point at a blob in S3 or something like that. That's what you want. But then again, that's where you hit this limitation of, you would have to find a way to having the same base path or base URL, and then somehow find a way to, because at the moment the core VFD, if you give that a URL, the core VFD wouldn't know what to do with that. And again, there are definitely ways to hack this, because all this stuff sits as structs in memory and so forth. And once the sort of drivers are loaded and initialized and so forth, these structures are in user space. You can do anything you want with these structures if you know where they are and what they look like. But I don't see an easy way to do that directly. Okay, does that make sense?
Yes, Garrett. I was thinking along the lines of using the Sec3 driver for the quote metadata, and then S3 using that for the non-metadata, the large stuff.
Yeah.
And I understand your point about using the core driver, and I hadn't thought of that, but I was thinking then that base name that the user opens is really the base name that's going to be deciphered by the stack drivers onto the local POSIX store for the initial metadata read. Does that make sense? So I've got this hybrid of POSIX and S3.
Yeah. And if you could do, again, I don't know what's possible these days with, for example, Fuse plugins, or with sort of loopback mounts, or for example, if you made the non-metadata portion a symbolic link, but the path in the, I don't know if that's possible, but I think it should be possible, if you make the path in the symbolic link really a URL. I don't know. Again, this is something that's not tested, but if you're lucky, then the OS will look at the symbolic link and pretty much give that symbolic link to the read-only S3 driver, which will try. Again, that's where it may fall down. The read-only S3 driver will probably expect a URL and see that file name, so to speak, and that's probably where it will drop it. But if there were an extra step where the read-only S3 driver would say, well, let me look at this thing, discover that this is a symbolic link, look at the value of that symbolic link and see, aha, this is a URL. I know what to do with a URL, and then go off and do its thing. I think that this sort of, there is a little bit of a last mile problem here, so to speak.
Okay.
but functionally, in terms of how the VFD, the virtual file layer, and the virtual driver architecture works, it should work, because at that level we are completely at sort of byte and file level. There are no more HDF objects. It's all about things that look like files and doing seeks and reading from offsets and writing to offsets, and it's really, HDF is long gone at that point.
Okay. Understood.
And then let's see, there's no provision for putting on S3 and the others on again, with the caveats, well, with the first caveat, it's not been tested as far as I know. And then, the main limitation right now, and that's of course a question, if that, if it would make sense to, in a way, extend the, it would be, in a way, an easy extension of both the split, but also the multi-file driver interface, where instead of requiring to have the same common prefix for all these suffixes or extensions, is, as an alternative, be able to provide an array of prefixes that would then be paired with their corresponding suffixes. That would solve this problem cleanly. So you could, in a way, develop a call where, going back, let's take, for example, setfapl split, have another setfapl split call where you also, in addition to this extension here, have either, so in this case, it would be one additional string argument for each pair of parameters here, where you can specify a prefix. But then, of course, you could say, well, why don't you specify the whole thing in one go, rather than providing the prefix and suffix separately? But yeah, unfortunately, this invariant, this sort of base name invariant, is baked both into the split and into the multi APIs. But it wouldn't be too difficult to, again, just roll your own versions of that and then have independent prefixes, and to not have to do two kludgy things.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Good.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was very good. I did not have that understanding of the stack drivers, so that cleared that up very nicely. Thank you.
Yeah. Again, sort of modulo the fact that this is by and large untested, I think from an architectural point of view, this should all work. It's really, unfortunately, you are up against, in a way, a mindset that this was written with file systems in mind and so forth, and nobody thought about providing different prefixes or base names. And although, I'm afraid what would not work is if you took this to the extreme. In a sense, you could think, well, why don't I specify what are called extension here? Why don't I specify the full path name or URL? So let's say we put a full path name here, or a full path name here and a full URL here, but the base name would be empty. I have not tried that. I do not know what would happen if you created that, if you were to use an empty string as the file name for sort of the terminal drivers. I do not know what would happen. I would have to look at the code, but then again, I wouldn't want to rely on an implementation detail that this may just work, but it would rely on the fact that, okay, the library doesn't mind if the base file name can be the empty string. But then I would expect the library would probably, well, maybe the library just checks for, again, I don't know what the code looks like, because the library may only check for, is that string not null? And the empty string certainly wouldn't be the null string. I don't know if but if the library checked whether that string is basically blank, then that would be problematic. So you might be lucky. I just don't know.
Okay.
I don't know if you're specifying a full path name and the full URL here, and then make that base name the empty string. If you're lucky, that will work. If you're unlucky, the library will complain about that empty string. But there is a certain chance that it will only check whether that string is null. And if it's non-null, it will not do any further checking. So there is a chance.
Okay.
Maybe. Sorry. Okay. And okay, we have 5 minutes, so let's maybe, unless there are any other questions, I'm going to pause. Are there any other questions? No? Okay, good. Let's quickly look at, there were a few forum posts, but also an announcement, big announcement. We just agreed with our friends and users in Europe that there will be a HDF users group meeting in Europe 2022. Here's the link to the website. It will happen on 3 to 4 days between May 31st and June 2nd. And it will be at the ITER site in the southeast of France, near Aix-en-Provence. So very beautiful spot. And it's not just for European users. I would encourage everybody who is interested and has time to go there. And oh, I haven't updated it yet. There's a typo here. I would recommend, yeah, you reserve your spot before telling your friends. Because yeah, we hope that a lot of people will turn out face to face. It will be available, so it will be face to face, but it will be streamed online. So people who can't be there will have the opportunity to connect online. Although again, since this will be, I believe, 7 hours ahead, and the meetings will start probably 9 o'clock, around 9:30 in the morning. So that's pretty early here, unless you are a night owl. So that might be tough to catch some of these sessions. But then, hey, there will be also recordings and so forth. And then nothing better to do for breakfast than sort of catch up on the morning recordings here, and then maybe dial in the afternoon. Okay, so that's a big announcement, and yeah, I think Laurie will also post that on the forum. Other than that, on the forum, there were a few things. Yeah, there was something that has come up in the past, and another user was just asking, and I quickly scanned it. This was something where it wasn't clear if it was an H5Pi issue, but it had something to do with the seeming inability to distinguish 2 different HDF5 files on some of these cloud drives. And but I remember, yeah, posting a snippet of C code, and the user back then confirmed, or one of the users confirmed, that it wasn't a C issue. The C library was perfectly fine disambiguating these 2 HDF5 files, and it seemed like an H5Pi issue. But I think the person who reposted a similar question was basically saying, I'm having this problem, but without very much additional context. Then somebody sent an example program about an issue with native long double, which is a little bit of a complicated thing. It's one of these things where, okay, it's in the C standard, but then the C standard says, okay, it has to be at least 16 bytes or something. So it's something rather wishy-washy. And I think the problem is it's definitely a configuration property when you build the HDF5 library, where the library basically checks whether type conversions are available to long and all kinds of other things. But unfortunately, the user didn't specify which version of the library, which platform, which processor architecture, and whatnot. So we need a little more to understand maybe the issue that user is having. And then somebody else just posted something about reading and writing multiple files using multiple threads. And again, yeah, Stephen posted a good comment, basically cautioning about too high expectations on miracles that multi-threading allegedly can do. But then again, there is just context missing. The user refers to some kind of text-based format, CB, CSV, doesn't ring a bell to me. So I don't really know much. I don't really know anything about the data that this user wants to process and how he wants to process the data. So early days, maybe next time we'll have more to report. And then, yeah, I'm going to punt this again to next week. Maybe next week we get a chance to talk about HDF. And this is, I think, Robert, somewhat related to your question also, what you can do with HDF5 applications or clients more broadly in cloud-based environments. And we'll get to that next time.
Yes.
But yeah, thanks again. Great questions. And yeah, I hope those of you who made it today, please come back next time, and we'll talk more HDF5.
Okay, thanks again. Very good.
Bye.